The day my wife's lawyer handed me the alimony demand, I didn't recognize the woman described in those 17 pages. According to the filing, Rachel had abandoned a promising marketing career to support my ambitions, sacrificed her professional identity to raise children we never had, and devoted herself entirely to our household while I climbed the corporate ladder. The document painted me as a selfish executive who'd built his success on her silent labor. It requested $42,000 in annual spousal support for an indefinite period. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Daniel Carter, 41 years old, and I've spent the last decade as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm in Portland. The numbers in that filing were designed to break me. What Rachel didn't know was that I'd already seen her LinkedIn profile. The one she updated every few months. The one listing her current position as senior brand director at a tech startup, complete with a salary range that made my income look modest. The profile she'd apparently forgotten existed when she decided to play the sacrificial wife in court. Marriage has a way of showing you who someone really is, but only if you're willing to look. For most of our 12 years together, I wasn't looking closely enough. Rachel and I met at a mutual friend's barbecue in the summer of 2011. She worked in advertising then, pulling long hours at a downtown agency that specialized in consumer brands. I was finishing my MBA and working construction management during the day. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours, standing by a grill that had long since gone cold, talking about everything from architecture to terrible action movies. She had this way of listening that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. I thought I'd found someone who saw the world the same way I did. We dated for 2 years before I proposed on a hiking trip to Crater Lake. The ring was modest because my student loans were not, but she cried anyway and said yes before I'd finished the speech I'd practiced for a week. Our wedding was small, held in her parents' backyard with maybe 60 people and a playlist instead of a band. We honeymooned in Vancouver because it was close and cheap, and we spent most of it walking around the city eating street food and taking photos we never got around to printing. Looking back, those early years felt solid. We had the usual adjustments, figuring out whose turn it was to grocery shop, how to split the bills, whether to save for a house or enjoy our 20s while they lasted. We settled on a compromise, a small condo in southeast Portland that needed work but had good bones. I spent weekends fixing the place up while Rachel worked on building her career. She changed agencies twice in 5 years, each time moving up in title and salary. By 2018, she was pulling in nearly as much as I was, and we talked about the future with the kind of optimism that feels naive now. The cracks started small. Rachel began traveling more for work, client meetings in San Francisco and Seattle that stretched from overnight trips to long weekends. She'd come back exhausted, telling stories about difficult presentations and demanding executives, and I'd listen while making dinner or folding laundry. I didn't think much of it at first. Ambitious people work hard. That's what I told myself. But there were other signs I chose to ignore. The way she'd angle her phone away when texting. The new wardrobe that seemed too polished for Zoom calls from home. The gym membership she used religiously, coming back toned and energized in ways that never translated to our bedroom. We still had date nights, still watched movies on the couch, still went through the motions of being married. But somewhere along the way, the substance had leaked out and left only the routine. By 2022, we were roommates who shared a mortgage. When she asked for a divorce last April, I wasn't shocked. I was almost relieved. She said she needed space to find herself, that we'd grown apart, that it wasn't anyone's fault. Standard breakup language that sounded rehearsed. We agreed to handle things amicably, split everything down the middle, and move on like adults. I even helped her pack boxes and load her car when she moved into an apartment downtown. She hugged me before she left and said she hoped we could still be friends someday. I believed her. That was my first mistake. The divorce petition arrived in June, delivered by a process server who caught me getting the mail in sweatpants on a Saturday morning. The language was cold and transactional, which I expected, but the tone struck me as unnecessarily hostile. It referenced irreconcilable differences and requested a division of assets. Fine. We'd talked about that. What I didn't expect was the motion for spousal support that landed 3 weeks later. Rachel's attorney had filed a separate document outlining her claim for alimony, and reading it felt like being introduced to a stranger who happened to share my wife's name. The narrative was elaborate and detailed. According to the filing, Rachel had been on a partner track at her advertising agency in 2015 when I'd pressured her to scale back her hours to focus on starting a family. She claimed she'd turned down a promotion and a significant raise to accommodate my timeline for children, a timeline that apparently I'd then abandoned once she'd sacrificed her career trajectory. The document stated that she'd spent the next several years in lower-level positions, taking contract work and freelance gigs to maintain flexibility for the family we were supposedly planning. It said she'd put my career first, supporting my advancement while her own professional identity withered. It described her as financially dependent, professionally stalled, and entitled to compensation for the opportunities she'd surrendered to our marriage. The dollar amount requested was calculated based on the difference between what she currently earned and what she would have earned had she stayed on her original career path. $42,000 per year, indefinitely, until she remarried or one of us died. I read the document 3 times, sitting at my kitchen table with a beer getting warm in my hand. The story it told was compelling. It was detailed and specific, full of dates and job titles and salary figures. If I didn't know better, I might have believed it. But I did know better. Rachel hadn't scaled back her career in 2015. She'd changed agencies and gotten a better title. We'd talked about kids in the abstract, the way most couples do, but we'd never set a timeline or made concrete plans. I'd never pressured her to do anything except maybe clean the kitchen more often. And the claim that she'd spent recent years doing contract work was baffling, because she'd been employed full-time at the same tech company for the last 18 months. I knew because I'd seen the offer letter when it came. She'd celebrated by taking me to dinner and talking about stock options. None of this aligned with the victim narrative her lawyer was selling. I felt anger rising, the kind that starts in your chest and spreads to your hands. But underneath the anger was something colder. Clarity. Rachel wasn't just leaving me. She was rewriting our history to fund her exit. I called my attorney the next morning. His name was Gordon Vasquez, a no-nonsense family lawyer in his late 50s who'd been recommended by a colleague at work. Gordon had handled my initial divorce filing with efficiency and minimal drama, and I'd appreciated his straightforward style. When I explained the alimony motion, he was quiet for a moment before asking me to email him the documents. I sent them from my phone while still on the call, and I could hear him scrolling through pages on his end. After a minute, he let out a low whistle. "This is aggressive," he said. "She's painting herself as a stay-at-home spouse without actually having stayed home." I told him about Rachel's job, the senior brand director position she'd held since late 2021. He asked if I had proof. I said I thought so, but I wasn't sure what would hold up in court. He told me to find out everything I could about her current employment and income, and to do it quickly. We had 30 days to respond to the motion, and he needed ammunition. I asked him what kind of ammunition. He said the kind that shows a judge she's lying. I spent that afternoon thinking about where to start. Rachel and I had separated our finances months ago, so I didn't have access to her bank statements or pay stubs. We'd split passwords and closed joint accounts. I couldn't exactly call her employer and ask for verification. But then I remembered something obvious, something so simple I almost laughed. LinkedIn. Everyone in the professional world has a LinkedIn profile, and most people keep them updated because networking never stops. Rachel was no exception. She'd always been diligent about her online presence, treating social media like a professional portfolio. I opened my laptop, logged into LinkedIn, and searched her name. Her profile loaded in seconds. The header image was a polished photo of her at some corporate event, smiling in a blazer with a conference backdrop behind her. Her headline read Senior Brand Director at Velocity Digital, a tech startup based in Portland that specialized in app development and digital marketing. I scrolled down and started taking notes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her current position listed a start date of September 2021, which matched my memory. The description outlined her responsibilities: leading brand strategy for a portfolio of mobile applications, managing a team of 6, overseeing multi-channel campaigns with budgets exceeding $2 million annually. It sounded impressive because it was impressive. Below that was her employment history, a clean timeline showing her progression through various agencies and companies over the past 15 years. There were no gaps. No periods of unemployment or contract work. No evidence of career sacrifice or professional stalling. Just a steady upward trajectory of titles and responsibilities. I kept scrolling. Her skills section listed expertise in brand development, digital marketing, team leadership, and strategic planning. She had over 300 connections, endorsements from colleagues, and recommendations from former managers praising her creativity and drive. One recommendation from a VP at her current company called her an invaluable asset to the team. Another from a previous employer described her as one of the most talented marketers I've had the privilege of working with. These weren't the accolades of someone who'd been sidelined or forced into lesser roles. These were the markers of someone who'd built a successful career on her own merits. I took screenshots of everything. The profile header, the job descriptions, the recommendations, the timeline. I saved them to a folder on my desktop labeled legal documents and backed them up to a cloud drive. Then I did something I hadn't done in months. I looked at her connections list. I recognized names from her industry, people she'd worked with at various agencies, former colleagues, and clients. I clicked through to a few of their profiles, cross-referencing job changes and company affiliations. Everything aligned. Rachel's story was consistent across the professional network. She was exactly who she claimed to be online, which was the opposite of who she claimed to be in court. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. How do you reconcile a woman who proudly displays her career achievements online with one who claims in legal documents to have sacrificed that same career? The answer was simple. You don't reconcile it. You expose it. I emailed the screenshots to Gordon with a brief note explaining what I'd found. He replied within an hour. This is good. This is very good. Let me dig deeper and we'll build a response. I felt something shift inside me, a small restoration of balance. Rachel had tried to rewrite our story, but the internet doesn't forget. The truth was still out there, time-stamped and publicly available. All I had to do was bring it into the courtroom. Gordon moved quickly. Over the next 2 weeks, he hired a private investigator to verify Rachel's employment and income. The investigator, a former cop named Linda Chen, was thorough and discreet. She confirmed that Rachel was indeed employed full-time at Velocity Digital, that she managed a team, and that her salary was in the range of $95,000 annually, not including bonuses or stock options. Linda obtained pay stubs through legal channels, subpoenaing records from the company's HR department. She also pulled Rachel's tax returns from the previous 2 years, which showed consistent income well above what her alimony claims suggested. The financial picture was clear. Rachel wasn't struggling. She wasn't dependent. She was thriving. Gordon compiled everything into a response brief that was part legal argument and part investigative report. He outlined the facts methodically, contrasting Rachel's sworn statements in the alimony motion with the evidence of her actual career. He included printouts of her LinkedIn profile, annotated with highlights and notes. He attached Linda's findings, the employment verification, the pay stubs, the tax returns. He cited case law about spousal support being intended for dependent spouses, not those with substantial earning capacity. And he requested that the court deny the motion entirely and consider sanctions for filing a frivolous claim. The brief was devastating in its precision. I read it twice before signing off, feeling a grim satisfaction. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. Rachel had gambled that I wouldn't fight back, that I'd settle quietly to avoid prolonged conflict. She'd miscalculated. We filed our response on the 28th day of the 30-day deadline. Gordon liked to use every available minute to refine his arguments. He said judges notice when attorneys rush, and he wanted this to land with full weight. The court scheduled a hearing for mid-September, giving Rachel's attorney time to reply to our response if they chose. They did. The reply brief arrived 2 weeks later, and it was a masterclass in deflection. Rachel's lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Nguyen who had a reputation for aggressive advocacy, didn't deny the facts we'd presented. She couldn't. The evidence was too solid. Instead, she reframed the argument. She claimed that Rachel's current income was irrelevant because the alimony request was based on lost potential, not present circumstances. She argued that Rachel had indeed sacrificed career opportunities in 2015 and that her current success was the result of recent efforts to rebuild after years of stagnation. She suggested that LinkedIn profiles were curated self-promotion and didn't reflect the internal struggles Rachel had faced. She even implied that my decision to contest the alimony was evidence of ongoing financial control and emotional abuse, buzzwords designed to paint me as the villain. The brief requested that the court proceed with the hearing and give Rachel an opportunity to testify about her lived experience, which apparently trumped documented facts. Gordon read the reply and shook his head. "She's doubling down," he said. "This is going to get ugly at the hearing." I asked him if we had enough to win. He said we had more than enough, but family court judges have wide discretion and sometimes they let emotion override evidence. He told me to prepare for anything. The hearing was set for September 14th at 9 in the morning. I took the day off work and met Gordon at the courthouse, a blocky concrete building downtown that smelled like floor wax and stress. We checked in with the clerk and sat on a bench in the hallway, waiting for our case to be called. Rachel arrived 20 minutes later with Patricia, both of them dressed in conservative business attire. Rachel looked composed, her hair pulled back, her expression neutral. She didn't make eye contact with me. Patricia carried a leather briefcase that looked expensive. They sat on the opposite side of the hallway, and the space between us felt like a canyon. At 9:15, a bailiff called our case number and we filed into the courtroom. The room was smaller than I expected, with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly. The judge's bench sat elevated at the front, empty for the moment. There were 2 tables facing the bench, one for each side. Gordon and I took the table on the left. Rachel and Patricia took the right. A court reporter sat off to the side, fingers poised over a stenography machine. The bailiff told us to rise, and Judge Helen Kowalski entered from a side door. She was a woman in her early 60s with short gray hair and rimless glasses, wearing black robes and an expression that gave nothing away. We sat when she did. She glanced at a file on her desk, then looked up at both tables. "This is a motion for spousal support in the matter of Carter versus Carter," she said. Her voice was firm and even. "I've reviewed the briefs from both sides. Let's proceed with testimony." Patricia stood first. Patricia called Rachel to the stand. Rachel walked to the witness box with her head high, placed her hand on a Bible the bailiff offered, and swore to tell the truth. She sat down, smoothed her skirt, and folded her hands in her lap. Patricia began with softballs, establishing Rachel's background and the timeline of our marriage. Rachel spoke clearly and confidently, describing her early career in advertising, our decision to get married, the life we'd tried to build together. She said we'd talked about starting a family in 2015, that I'd been eager to have children and had encouraged her to prepare for that transition. She claimed she'd turned down a senior account manager position at her agency because the hours would have been incompatible with raising kids. She said the promotion would have come with a $40,000 raise and a clear path to partnership. Patricia asked why she'd made that choice. Rachel's voice softened. "I love Daniel," she said. "I wanted to build a future with him. I thought we were on the same page about what that future looked like. I trusted that if I made space for our family, he'd support me the way I was supporting him." Patricia asked what happened next. Rachel said I'd changed my mind about children a year later, telling her I wasn't ready and didn't know when I would be. She said I'd focused on my own career instead, taking on bigger projects and working longer hours, while she'd been left in a holding pattern professionally. She described taking freelance work and short-term contracts to stay flexible, believing we'd eventually revisit the family conversation. She said that by the time she realized I wasn't going to commit, she'd lost years of momentum and found herself starting over in her late 30s. The story was compelling. It was emotional and specific. It was also mostly fiction. Gordon stood for cross-examination. He approached the witness stand with a calm, almost friendly demeanor. He started by confirming basic facts, the dates of Rachel's job changes, the names of her employers, the titles she'd held. Rachel answered without hesitation, her confidence intact. Then Gordon shifted. Ms. Carter, you testified that you turned down a promotion in 2015 to prepare for starting a family. Is that correct? Rachel nodded. Yes. Gordon pulled a document from his folder. I have here a copy of your LinkedIn profile, printed last month. According to this, you were promoted to senior account executive at Morrison Brandt Agency in September 2015. Is that accurate? Rachel's expression flickered. She glanced at Patricia, then back at Gordon. That was a different role, she said. It wasn't the position I turned down. Gordon didn't pause. So you did receive a promotion in 2015? Rachel shifted in her seat. It was lateral, not a true advancement. Gordon smiled slightly. A senior title is typically considered an advancement, wouldn't you agree? Rachel's voice tightened. It depends on the responsibilities. Gordon moved on. You also testified that you spent recent years doing freelance and contract work. Can you tell the court what companies you worked for on a contract basis? Rachel hesitated. There were several. Small projects, mostly. Gordon waited. Can you name one? Rachel said a name I didn't recognize, something generic. Gordon nodded. And when did you work for them? Rachel said she thought it was 2019. Gordon pulled another document. I have your tax returns for 2019. They show W-2 income from only one employer, Cascade Digital Partners. Number 1099 forms for contract work. Can you explain that? Rachel's composure began to crack. I may have misremembered the year. Gordon's tone remained even. Ms. Carter, according to your LinkedIn profile and verified employment records, you've been employed full-time continuously since 2015. There are no gaps. No contract periods. Is that correct? Rachel looked at Patricia again. The judge intervened. Ms. Carter, please answer the question. Rachel took a breath. My LinkedIn doesn't show everything. Gordon pressed. But it does show your current position as Senior Brand Director at Velocity Digital, correct? Rachel nodded reluctantly. Yes. And you've held that position since September 2021? Yes. And according to documents provided by your employer, your current salary is $95,000 annually, not including bonuses. Is that accurate? Rachel's jaw tightened. I don't know the exact figure. Gordon held up a pay stub. This is from last month. It shows your gross income. Does this refresh your memory? Patricia objected. Your Honor, this is harassment. The judge looked at Patricia over her glasses. Overruled. The witness will answer. Rachel stared at the document. Yes, that's approximately correct. Gordon returned to his table and picked up the printed LinkedIn profile. Ms. Carter, you have over 300 professional connections on LinkedIn. You have multiple recommendations from colleagues praising your work. You list skills, achievements, and career milestones. Does this profile reflect someone whose career has stalled? Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper. It's complicated. Gordon's final question was simple. Ms. Carter, have you ever updated your LinkedIn profile to reflect the career struggles you described in your alimony motion? Rachel didn't answer. The silence stretched until the judge instructed her to respond. Rachel finally said no. Gordon sat down. No further questions. Patricia tried to rehabilitate Rachel on redirect, asking her to explain the emotional toll of our marriage and the ways professional success doesn't always reflect personal sacrifice. Rachel talked about feeling unsupported, about the loneliness of watching me prioritize work over family, about the years she spent waiting for a future that never materialized. It was heartfelt and probably sincere in some ways. But it didn't change the facts. When Patricia finished, the judge asked if I would be testifying. Gordon said yes. I took the stand, swore the same oath Rachel had, and sat down. My heart was pounding but my hands were steady. Gordon asked me to describe our marriage. I kept it factual. I talked about our early years, the mutual support, the conversations about future goals. I said we'd discussed children but never set a concrete timeline, that Rachel's career had always been important to her and that I'd encouraged her ambitions. I described the condo we'd bought together, the life we'd built as equals. Gordon asked if I'd ever pressured Rachel to scale back her career. I said no, that her job changes had been her decisions and that I'd supported each one. He asked if I'd changed my mind about having children. I said we'd both been ambivalent, that it was a mutual realization we weren't ready, not a unilateral decision. Gordon asked about my income. I provided the figures, my salary as a project manager, my benefits, my savings. It was comfortable but not extravagant. Then he asked the key question. Mr. Carter, do you believe your ex-wife needs financial support from you? I looked at Rachel. She was staring at the table. I said no, that she was a capable professional with a successful career, that she earned nearly as much as I did, and that the idea she'd sacrificed anything for me was contradicted by her own public record. Patricia cross-examined me, trying to paint me as dismissive of Rachel's contributions and oblivious to her struggles. She asked if I'd kept track of household labor, if I'd acknowledged the emotional work Rachel had done, if I understood the concept of unpaid domestic contributions. I answered honestly. We'd split chores. We'd both worked full-time. We'd both contributed. Patricia asked if I thought Rachel deserved nothing after 12 years of marriage. I said she deserved half of what we'd built together, which was what I'd already offered in the divorce settlement. What she didn't deserve was to be paid for a sacrifice she'd never made. Patricia sat down, her expression tight. Judge Kowalski asked both attorneys if they had closing arguments. Gordon stood first. He summarized the evidence, the LinkedIn profile, the employment records, the tax returns, the inconsistencies in Rachel's testimony. He argued that spousal support was meant to address actual financial need and dependency, not to compensate for hypothetical lost opportunities. He pointed out that Rachel earned a substantial income, managed a professional team, and had demonstrated career success independent of our marriage. He asked the court to deny the motion entirely. Patricia's closing was passionate. She talked about the invisible labor of women in marriage, the ways career sacrifices show up in missed promotions and deferred ambitions. She argued that Rachel's current success didn't erase the years she'd spent accommodating my priorities. She said the court had an obligation to recognize the economic value of Rachel's contributions, even if they didn't fit traditional models of dependency. She asked for the full alimony amount requested. Judge Kowalski listened to both without interruption. When they finished, she removed her glasses and set them on the bench. She looked at Rachel, then at me, then at the stack of documents in front of her. I've reviewed the materials submitted by both parties, she said. I've heard the testimony. I've considered the arguments. She paused. The purpose of spousal support is to address financial disparity and dependency arising from marriage. It is not intended to penalize one spouse or reward another. It is meant to ensure that both parties can maintain a reasonable standard of living post-divorce, particularly when one spouse has sacrificed earning capacity for the benefit of the marriage. Her tone was measured, almost clinical. In this case, the evidence does not support the petitioner's claim of financial need or career sacrifice. Ms. Carter is employed full-time in a senior leadership role with substantial income. Her professional trajectory, as documented in her own public profile and verified by employment records, shows consistent advancement. There are no gaps, no demotions, no indications of career stalling. She looked at Rachel. Ms. Carter, your testimony about turning down a promotion in 2015 is contradicted by your own LinkedIn profile, which shows you received a promotion that same year. Your claim of taking contract work to remain flexible is contradicted by your tax returns, which show continuous W-2 employment. Your assertion of financial dependency is contradicted by pay stubs showing income comparable to your ex-husband's. The judge's voice hardened slightly. This court takes allegations of career sacrifice seriously. But it also takes seriously the responsibility of parties to present truthful and accurate information. The evidence here suggests that the motion for alimony was based on misrepresentations. She picked up her glasses and put them back on. Accordingly, the motion for spousal support is denied. Each party will bear their own attorney's fees. The divorce will proceed as previously outlined, with assets divided equitably per the original petition. We're adjourned. The gavel struck once, a sharp crack that echoed in the small room. It was over. Rachel stood abruptly, her face flushed, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Patricia gathered her materials with tight, controlled movements. Gordon leaned over and shook my hand. That went as well as it could have, he said quietly. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. We packed up and left the courtroom. In the hallway, I saw Rachel standing near the elevators with Patricia, their heads close together in intense conversation. I didn't approach. There was nothing left to say. Gordon walked me out of the building and we stood on the courthouse steps in the late morning sun. He told me the final divorce decree would be issued in a few weeks, that I should expect some paperwork but nothing complicated. He said to reach out if Rachel or her attorney tried anything else, but he doubted they would. The ruling was clear. I thanked him and we shook hands again before he headed back to his office. I stood there for a few minutes, watching people come and go from the courthouse, all of them carrying their own legal battles and personal dramas. I felt exhausted and relieved in equal measure. The process had been draining, but it was finally done. Rachel had tried to rewrite history, and the judge had handed her back the truth. I walked to my car, got in, and sat in the driver's seat with the windows down. My phone buzzed with a text from my brother, asking how it went. I replied with 2 words, we won. He sent back a thumbs up and a beer mug emoji. Simple, but enough. I started the engine and drove home, taking the long way through the city, letting the afternoon unfold at its own pace. When I got back to the condo, I made a sandwich, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sat on the back patio. The yard needed mowing and the fence needed paint, but those could wait. For now, I just wanted to sit in the quiet and let the weight of the last few months finally lift. The weeks following the hearing passed in a strange, muted calm. The final divorce decree arrived in early October, signed by Judge Kowalski and stamped with the court seal. It outlined the division of assets, the closure of joint accounts, and the official dissolution of our marriage. No alimony. No ongoing obligations beyond what we'd already agreed to split. I filed the papers in a folder and put it in a drawer. The condo sold faster than I expected. Rachel and I had listed it in late summer, and by mid-October we had a solid offer from a young couple expecting their first child. The irony wasn't lost on me. We split the proceeds down the middle, exactly as planned. I used my half as a down payment on a small house in Selwood, a neighborhood I'd always liked. It was a fixer-upper, but I'd spent years in construction and didn't mind the work. Fixing things with my hands felt therapeutic, a way to rebuild something tangible while the intangible parts of my life settled. I heard through mutual friends that Rachel had moved to Seattle for a new job, another promotion at a different tech company. The news didn't surprise me. She'd always been ambitious, always looking for the next opportunity. I hoped the fresh start would give her whatever she was searching for. As for me, I focused on the basics. I showed up to work, managed my projects, and kept my head down. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during the marriage, old buddies from college and guys I'd worked with over the years. We grabbed beers, watched games, and talked about nothing important. It was exactly what I needed. I started running again, something I'd let slide for years. Early mornings through the neighborhood, just me and the pavement and the rhythm of my breath. It cleared my head and reminded me that I still had control over something, even if it was just putting one foot in front of the other. By Thanksgiving, I felt lighter. My brother hosted dinner at his place, and I drove down to Eugene with a pie I'd bought from the grocery store. His wife greeted me with a hug and a knowing look, the kind that said she'd heard the whole story and was proud I'd gotten through it. We ate too much, watched football, and didn't talk about divorce or lawyers or any of it. It was normal and comfortable, and I realized how much I'd missed normal. That night, driving back to Portland under a sky full of stars, I thought about the hearing and Judge Kowalski's words. The truth had mattered. Facts had mattered. In a system that sometimes felt arbitrary, justice had shown up. I'd gone into that courtroom with evidence and left with vindication, not because I was perfect, but because I'd been honest. Rachel had gambled on a story that didn't hold up, and the consequences were hers to carry. I didn't feel victorious, just relieved. The chapter was closed. By Christmas, I'd finished painting the living room and had started replacing the kitchen cabinets. The house was coming together, one project at a time. I hung stockings over the fireplace, more out of habit than tradition, and spent the holiday volunteering at a local shelter. It felt good to be useful, to focus on something beyond my own mess. A friend from work set me up on a date in January, a casual coffee meet with a woman named Laura who taught high school English. We talked about books and bad movies and the challenges of home renovation. It was easy and uncomplicated, and while nothing came of it romantically, it reminded me that there was life beyond the wreckage of my marriage. I wasn't damaged goods. I was just someone learning to start over. Looking back now, almost a year later, I can see the lessons buried in all of it. Marriage is built on trust, and when that trust breaks, the fractures run deep. But betrayal doesn't have to define you. Rachel tried to use the system to rewrite history, to cast herself as a victim and me as a villain. She underestimated the power of documentation and the importance of truth. The LinkedIn profile she'd maintained so carefully became the evidence that dismantled her case. Social media has a way of preserving reality, whether we intend it to or not. I learned to trust my instincts. When the alimony demand landed, something in me knew it was wrong. I could have ignored that instinct, could have settled to avoid conflict. But I chose to fight, and that choice mattered. Gordon and Linda and Judge Kowalski all played their parts, but ultimately, the outcome came down to my willingness to stand up for the truth. I also learned that endings don't have to be bitter to be necessary. Rachel and I weren't meant to stay married. We'd grown in different directions, wanted different things, and that's okay. The divorce itself wasn't the problem. The problem was her attempt to profit from a false narrative. When that failed, the actual ending, the legal dissolution, the division of property, the moving on, was almost anticlimactic. We just went our separate ways, the way people do. I don't hate Rachel. I don't spend my days rehashing old grievances or imagining alternate outcomes. She made choices that didn't work out the way she planned, and she'll have to live with those. I made choices too, some good, some less so, and I'm living with mine. The difference is I can sleep at night knowing I told the truth when it mattered most. The house in Selwood is coming along. I've replaced the floors, updated the bathroom, and I'm halfway through building a deck in the backyard. My brother jokes that I should start a side business as a contractor, but I like keeping it personal. These projects are mine, something I'm creating for myself. On weekends, I host small gatherings, friends coming over for burgers and cards, nothing fancy. The house feels lived in now, like it's becoming home. Work is steady. I took on a new project managing the renovation of a historic building downtown, and it's challenging in all the right ways. My boss pulled me aside last month and said I'm being considered for a director role, a promotion that would come with more responsibility and better pay. I'm thinking about it. For the first time in a long time, I'm thinking about the future without the weight of the past dragging behind me. I started dating again, nothing serious yet, Just getting to know people and remembering how to be open. It's awkward sometimes, explaining that I'm divorced, navigating the questions about what happened. But I keep it simple. We grew apart. It didn't work out. Most people don't need the full story, and I don't need to relive it. The ones who matter will see who I am now, not who I was in a failed marriage. I've also started writing, nothing public, just a journal where I process thoughts and document the rebuild. It helps to see progress on paper, to track how far I've come from that morning when the alimony demand landed in my mailbox. That version of me felt blindsided and powerless. This version knows better. I have agency. I have truth. And I have a life that's mine to shape. If there's a takeaway from all of this, it's that accountability matters. Rachel tried to avoid it, but the system held her to it anyway. And I held myself to it too, making sure my story was honest and my actions defensible. The divorce decree might have been final, but the aftermath had its own momentum. Rachel's attempt to claim alimony had failed spectacularly in court, but that didn't stop her from trying to control the narrative outside of it. Within days of the hearing, she'd posted a lengthy statement on Facebook about her experience with the family court system. The post was carefully worded, never mentioning me by name but making it clear who she was talking about. She wrote about women being silenced, about the ways professional success can be weaponized against you, about judges who don't understand the invisible labor of marriage. She framed herself as a cautionary tale, warning other women to protect themselves financially before it's too late. The post got hundreds of reactions and dozens of comments, most of them supportive. Friends and acquaintances rallied around her, offering sympathy and outrage. A few people who knew both of us stayed silent, which I appreciated more than any public defense. I didn't respond. Gordon had advised me early on to avoid social media battles, and I trusted his judgment. Engaging would only give Rachel's version oxygen. Instead, I focused on the documentation I already had. The court record was public. Anyone who cared enough to look could see what actually happened. My brother called me the night Rachel's post went viral in our social circle. He was angry, ready to write his own response defending me. I told him not to bother. People who know me know the truth, I said. People who don't aren't going to be convinced by a Facebook argument. He didn't like it, but he backed off. His wife sent me a private message later that night. She said she'd seen the post and wanted me to know they had my back, no matter what anyone else thought. That kind of quiet support meant more than any public showdown ever could. A few days later, one of Rachel's friends reached out to me directly. Her name was Stephanie, and we'd been friendly during the marriage, attending the same dinner parties and holiday gatherings. She sent a careful text asking if we could talk. I agreed to meet her for coffee, curious about what she wanted. We met at a place in Northwest Portland, neutral territory where neither of us were regulars. Stephanie looked uncomfortable from the moment she sat down. She ordered tea and spent the first 5 minutes making small talk before finally getting to the point. She said she'd seen Rachel's Facebook post and wanted to hear my side. She was diplomatic about it, acknowledging that there were always two perspectives in any divorce. I appreciated the gesture but didn't sugarcoat anything. I told her about the alimony claim, the false narrative, the LinkedIn profile that contradicted everything Rachel had sworn to in court. I showed her the screenshots I still had on my phone, the same ones Gordon had presented to the judge. Stephanie studied them quietly, her expression shifting from polite interest to genuine surprise. She asked why Rachel would do that. I said I'd been asking myself the same question for months. The best answer I could come up with was desperation, a need to justify the divorce by casting me as the bad guy. If I was the selfish husband who'd derailed her career, then leaving me made sense. If we'd just grown apart as equals, the story was less satisfying. Stephanie admitted she'd had doubts about Rachel's version even before seeing my evidence. She said Rachel had always been competitive, always measuring herself against others. During our marriage, Rachel had occasionally made comments to friends about my career versus hers, comparing salaries and opportunities in ways that felt more like scorekeeping than partnership. Stephanie hadn't thought much of it at the time, but looking back, she could see the pattern. We talked for over an hour. Stephanie said she wouldn't be sharing what I'd told her with Rachel, that their friendship had already been strained by other issues. She thanked me for being honest and said she hoped I'd find peace on the other side of all this. I thanked her for reaching out. It was a small moment of validation, but it mattered. Not everyone was willing to question Rachel's narrative, and Stephanie's willingness to listen felt like a quiet form of integrity. After she left, I sat in the coffee shop for a while longer, watching people come and go. The city moved at its own pace, indifferent to personal dramas. There was something comforting in that. My problems weren't the center of anyone's universe except my own. Life went on. I could either stay stuck in the past or keep building the future. Work became my anchor during those months. The historic building renovation downtown was a complex project involving old architecture, modern safety codes, and a tight budget. It required constant problem-solving, coordination between contractors, and attention to detail. I threw myself into it, arriving early and staying late, losing myself in blueprints and site inspections. My team noticed the shift in my energy. I'd always been a solid manager, but now I was operating at a different level, more focused, more driven. One of the senior foremen, a guy named Ray who'd been in construction for 30 years, pulled me aside one afternoon. He said whatever I was working through, I should keep channeling it into the job because the building was coming along better than expected. I appreciated the acknowledgement without the prying questions. Ray was old school in the best way, a man who understood that sometimes work is therapy. The project wrapped up in February, 2 weeks ahead of schedule and under budget. My boss was impressed enough to fast-track the director promotion we discussed. By March, I had a new title, a new salary, and a new set of responsibilities. The promotion came with longer hours and higher stakes, but I welcomed both. Staying busy kept me from dwelling on what I'd lost and reminded me of what I still had. Competence. Purpose. Forward momentum. The house renovation became another outlet. I'd tackled the major projects first, floors and bathrooms and structural repairs, but now I was working on the details. Crown molding in the living room. Built-in shelves in the den. A backsplash in the kitchen using reclaimed tile I'd found at a salvage yard. Each project was a small act of creation, transforming a rundown property into something I could be proud of. My neighbor, an older woman named Doris who'd lived on the street for 40 years, would stop by occasionally to check on my progress. She'd bring me lemonade in the summer and cookies in the winter, and we'd talk about the neighborhood's history. Doris had been widowed for a decade and had raised 3 kids in the house next door. She told me stories about block parties and school fundraisers, about watching families come and go over the years. She said the street needed younger people willing to invest in it, and she was glad I'd chosen to stay. Her approval felt like a benediction. By spring, the house was finished enough to host people. I invited my brother and his family over for dinner, cooking steaks on the new grill I'd bought for the deck. His kids ran around the backyard while the adults sat on patio furniture that still smelled like the store. My sister-in-law complimented the upgrades, said the place felt warm and welcoming. My brother raised his beer and said he was proud of me, not just for the house but for everything. We didn't need to say more than that. He knew what the year had cost, and he knew I'd come through it standing. Dating was the hardest part of rebuilding. I'd been with Rachel for over a decade, and the idea of starting over with someone new felt exhausting. But isolation wasn't the answer either. I needed to remember how to connect, how to be vulnerable without being reckless. A coworker named Brian set me up with his wife's friend, a woman named Jenna who worked in graphic design. We met for drinks on a Thursday evening, both of us clearly nervous. Jenna was easy to talk to, funny and self-deprecating in a way that put me at ease. We talked about work, about Portland's food scene, about terrible reality TV shows we were both embarrassed to admit watching. It was pleasant but lacked spark. We parted ways with a polite hug and a mutual understanding that we'd stay friends. No harm, no awkwardness. A few weeks later, I tried a dating app, something I'd never used before. The experience was disorienting. Swiping through profiles felt transactional, reducing people to curated photos and clever bios. I matched with a few women, exchanged messages, went on a handful of first dates. Most of them were fine. Perfectly nice people who didn't click with me for reasons I couldn't articulate. One woman, a teacher named Amy, made it to a third date before we both acknowledged we were forcing something that wasn't there. She wished me luck and said she hoped I'd find what I was looking for. I appreciated her honesty. I wasn't sure what I was looking for either, but I knew I'd recognize it when it showed up. By summer, I'd settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable. Work was demanding but rewarding. The house was a source of pride. My social life was modest but genuine, built around a small circle of friends who knew me well. I wasn't lonely, but I wasn't fully content either. There was still a gap, a sense of incompleteness I couldn't quite name. I started volunteering with a nonprofit that built affordable housing, using my construction skills on weekends to help families in need. The work was physically exhausting but emotionally fulfilling. It reminded me that my problems were small compared to what others faced, and that I had something valuable to contribute beyond my own narrow concerns. One Saturday in July, I was working on a framing project when a woman from the nonprofit's office stopped by the site. Her name was Claire, and she was the volunteer coordinator. She'd come to drop off supplies and check on the crew's progress. We got to talking during a water break, and I learned she'd been with the organization for 5 years, drawn to the work after her own experience with housing insecurity in her 20s. Claire was direct and unpretentious, with a dry sense of humor that made me laugh. She asked if I'd be interested in leading a training session for new volunteers, teaching basic carpentry skills. I said I'd think about it. She handed me her card and told me to call if I was interested. There was no pressure, just an open invitation. I found myself thinking about that conversation more than I expected. A week later, I called Claire and said I'd be happy to lead the training session. We met at a coffee shop to discuss logistics, and the conversation expanded beyond work. She asked about my background, and I gave her the abbreviated version. Construction management, recent divorce, new house in Selwood. She shared her own story, a childhood in rural Oregon, a degree in social work, a passion for community development. We talked for 2 hours, long after the coffee had gone cold. When we finally stood to leave, Claire said she'd enjoyed the conversation and hoped we could do it again sometime. I said I'd like that. It wasn't a date, not officially, but it felt like the beginning of something. Over the next few months, Claire and I saw each other regularly. Sometimes it was work-related, coordinating volunteer projects or discussing the nonprofit's goals. Other times it was personal, grabbing dinner after a long day or meeting for a hike on the weekends. She was easy to be around, thoughtful and curious without being intrusive. She asked about my divorce once, and I gave her the honest version. She listened without judgment, then shared her own story of a relationship that had ended badly a few years earlier. We bonded over the shared experience of rebuilding after loss. By autumn, we were officially dating. It was different from what I'd had with Rachel, less intense but more grounded. Claire didn't need me to be anything other than who I was, and I felt the same about her. We moved slowly, taking time to know each other without rushing toward labels or commitments. It felt healthy, like something built on choice rather than momentum. Rachel resurfaced briefly in October, not directly but through a mutual acquaintance. A guy I had known from our old gym reached out to say he'd run into her at an event in Seattle. She'd mentioned the divorce in passing, he said, framing it as a relief to be free from a controlling relationship. He asked if I wanted to set the record straight. I told him the truth had already been established where it mattered, in court, and that I wasn't interested in relitigating it for strangers. He seemed satisfied with that answer. I realized then that Rachel would probably carry her version of events for the rest of her life, and that was her burden to bear, not mine. I couldn't control her narrative, but I could control my response to it. And my response was to keep moving forward. The holidays came around again, and this time they felt lighter. I spent Thanksgiving with my brother's family and Christmas with Claire and her parents at their place in Eugene. Her folks were kind and welcoming, the sort of people who made you feel at home within minutes. Her dad and I talked about construction and fishing, easy topics that required no emotional labor. Her mom asked thoughtful questions about my work and my house, genuinely interested in the answers. Over dinner, Claire's younger sister teased her about finally bringing someone home, and Claire blushed in a way that made me smile. It was domestic and ordinary, and I realized how much I'd missed ordinary. As the year came to a close, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come. 12 months earlier, I'd been sitting in a courtroom watching my ex-wife lie under oath. Now I was building a life that felt authentically mine, rooted in honesty and sustained by people who valued the same. The divorce had been painful, but it had also been clarifying. It had forced me to examine what I wanted, what I was willing to tolerate, and what I deserved. I'd learned that standing up for the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, is worth the effort. I'd learned that documentation matters, that facts have power, and that integrity can't be faked. Most importantly, I'd learned that endings don't have to destroy you. They can also free you. Rachel had tried to use the system to rewrite our history, to extract compensation for sacrifices she'd never made. She'd underestimated the importance of truth and overestimated her ability to manipulate perception. The LinkedIn profile she'd so carefully maintained became the tool of her undoing. In trying to have it both ways, successful professional and victimized spouse, she'd created a contradiction too obvious to ignore. Judge Kowalski had seen through it immediately, and the ruling had been swift and unambiguous. No alimony. No reward for dishonesty. Just the fair division of assets we'd both agreed to from the start. Looking ahead, I felt optimistic for the first time in years. The director role at work was challenging but manageable. The house was a source of constant small joys, each finished project adding to the sense of home. Claire and I were building something genuine, taking our time and enjoying the process. I'd reconnected with old friends and made new ones through volunteering. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, shaped by choices I could defend and values I believed in. If I could offer advice to anyone going through something similar, it would be this. Trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, investigate. Don't accept a narrative just because someone presents it confidently. Gather evidence. Document everything. And don't be afraid to stand up for the truth, even when it's easier to let things slide. The legal system isn't perfect, but it does respond to facts. If you come prepared with documentation, timelines, and proof, you give yourself the best chance at a fair outcome. Also, be patient with yourself. Divorce is a process, not an event. It takes time to untangle a shared life, to grieve what you've lost, and to imagine what comes next. There will be hard days and setbacks. There will be moments when you question whether fighting was worth it. But if you stay focused on truth and integrity, you'll come through it with your dignity intact. That's worth more than any settlement or vindication. The other lesson is about social media and public perception. Rachel's Facebook post tried to rally support by painting me as the villain. For a while, it worked within her circle. But public opinion is fickle and ultimately shallow. The people who matter, the ones who know you well, will see through false narratives. And the people who don't know you well enough to see through them aren't worth worrying about. I chose not to engage publicly, and that restraint served me better than any rebuttal could have. Silence, backed by documented truth, has its own power. Finally, don't let bitterness consume you. Rachel made choices I'll never fully understand. She lied in court, manipulated the legal system, and tried to profit from a fabricated version of our marriage. I could spend years being angry about that, replaying the injustice and nursing resentment. But anger is exhausting, and it only hurts the person holding it. I chose to let it go, not because Rachel deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved peace. The court had ruled. The truth had prevailed. My job was to move forward, not to dwell in the past. As winter settled in again, I found myself sitting on the deck I'd built, bundled in a jacket and watching snow fall quietly over the backyard. The house was warm behind me. Claire was inside making tea. My phone buzzed with a text from my brother, a dumb meme that made me laugh. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Contentment. Not the restless satisfaction of checking boxes or achieving goals, but the deeper, quieter contentment of knowing I was exactly where I needed to be. The divorce was behind me. The lies had been exposed. The truth had won. And I was free to build whatever came next. Spring arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after surviving a hard winter. The cherry blossoms along my street bloomed early, turning the neighborhood into something out of a postcard. I'd wake up to sunlight streaming through windows I'd installed myself, brew coffee in a kitchen I'd rebuilt with my own hands, and feel a sense of ownership over my life that had nothing to do with property titles. Claire had essentially moved in by April, though we hadn't made it official. Her toothbrush appeared in the bathroom, then her running shoes by the door, then half her wardrobe in the closet. We fell into an easy domesticity that felt natural rather than forced. She'd cook while I cleaned up. I'd handle the yard work while she organized the interior. We worked on the nonprofit projects together on weekends, teaching carpentry skills to families building their own futures. It was partnership in its truest form, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than grand romantic gestures. The LinkedIn situation had one final chapter one hadn't anticipated. In May, I received an email from a reporter at a local business journal. She was working on a story about social media and divorce proceedings, how online profiles were increasingly being used as evidence in family court. She'd come across the public record of my case and wanted to interview me about the experience. I was hesitant at first, not wanting to relitigate the past or publicly humiliate Rachel. But Gordon, who I consulted before responding, pointed out that the story could help other people going through similar situations. The interview happened over the phone and lasted about 40 minutes. I kept my answers factual, focusing on the importance of documentation and the ways people's online personas can contradict their legal claims. The reporter asked if I felt vindicated by the judge's ruling. I said vindication wasn't the right word, that I'd simply wanted the truth to be heard, and it had been. The article ran in June with a headline about digital footprints in family law. My case was featured as a primary example, though names were changed for privacy. The piece quoted employment attorneys and family law experts discussing the trend of LinkedIn profiles being subpoenaed in alimony disputes. It was well researched and balanced, and I was relieved to see my story presented without sensationalism. A few people reached out after the article published, men and women going through divorces who'd read it and wanted advice. I responded to each one with the same counsel Gordon had given me. Document everything, hire competent legal representation, and don't let emotion override strategy. One man sent me a particularly moving email. He said his wife had claimed she'd given up her nursing career to raise their children, but he discovered she'd been working full-time at a hospital for the past 3 years while claiming unemployment in court documents. My story had given him the courage to fight back with evidence. He'd won his case and wanted to thank me. I told him he'd won it himself by refusing to accept a false narrative. That summer, Claire and I took a road trip down the Oregon coast, something I'd always wanted to do but had never made time for during my marriage. We stayed in small motels, ate at diners with vinyl booths, and hiked along beaches where the Pacific crashed against ancient rocks. One evening in Cannon Beach, sitting around a driftwood fire as the sun set, Claire asked me if I had any regrets about how things had ended with Rachel. I thought about it for a while before answering. I said I regretted the years I'd spent not seeing who she really was, but I didn't regret standing up for myself when it mattered. Claire nodded and said she respected that integrity under pressure was one of the things she loved about me. It was the first time either of us had used that word, and it hung in the air for a moment before I said it back. The fire crackled between us and the ocean kept its steady rhythm, and I thought about how different this felt from anything I'd experienced with Rachel. This was real. By autumn, I'd stopped thinking about the divorce entirely unless something specifically reminded me of it. The house was fully finished, every room reflecting choices Claire and I had made together. We'd adopted a dog from the shelter, a mixed breed named Murphy who had boundless energy and zero sense of personal space. Work continued to go well, my director role settling into something I could manage without burning out. The nonprofit had grown, expanding into 3 new neighborhoods with housing projects I was helping to oversee. Life had texture and meaning, built from dozens of small decisions that added up to something substantial. One Saturday in October, almost 2 years after the hearing, I was at a hardware store picking up supplies when I saw Rachel. She was in the garden section, looking at potted plants with a man I didn't recognize. They were laughing about something, his hand resting casually on her lower back. She looked happy, lighter than I remembered. For a split second, I considered approaching her, maybe offering a polite hello. But then I realized there was nothing to say. We'd said everything that needed saying in that courtroom. The judge's gavel had closed that chapter definitively. I turned down a different aisle and finished my shopping, and by the time I left the store, I'd already forgotten which plants she'd been looking at. Claire asked that night if something was on my mind. I told her about seeing Rachel, and she asked how it made me feel. I said it didn't really make me feel anything, which surprised me. I'd expected some residual anger or hurt, but there was just indifference. Claire smiled and said that was probably the healthiest possible outcome, that true healing looks like apathy rather than hatred. She was right. Rachel had become irrelevant to my life, a character in a story I no longer told. The lessons remained, the importance of truth and documentation, the value of standing firm when challenged, but the person who'd taught me those lessons had faded into background noise. That's when I knew I was genuinely past it. Not performing recovery or pretending to be over it, but actually, completely done. The scar tissue had formed and I'd moved on. The final piece of closure came in December when I received a notification that the court record from our divorce had been archived. It was a routine administrative process, but it felt symbolic. The case was officially closed, sealed away in some database where it would gather digital dust. I showed the notification to Claire and she suggested we celebrate. We went to a nice restaurant downtown, not the place where Rachel and I used to go for anniversaries, but somewhere new with no history attached. Over dinner, Claire raised her glass and made a simple toast. To new chapters, she said. I clinked my glass against hers and felt the weight of the past 2 years finally lift completely. The story was over. What came next was up to us. Looking back now, I can see how the LinkedIn profile became the fulcrum on which everything turned. Rachel had built a public persona of professional success while simultaneously constructing a legal narrative of professional sacrifice. She'd failed to realize that in the digital age, those two stories would eventually collide. Judge Kowalski had seen the contradiction immediately, and no amount of emotional testimony could overcome documented facts. The ruling had been correct and just, not because I was innocent or perfect, but because the evidence spoke louder than the performance. If there's wisdom to extract from the experience, it's that truth has staying power. Lies might work in the short term, might even be convincing to people who want to believe them, but lies collapse under scrutiny. Truth, properly documented and clearly presented, endures. Rachel bet everything on a narrative that couldn't withstand examination, and she lost because of it. I won not because I was smarter or better, but because I refused to let fiction replace fact. The house in Selwood is full now, lived in and loved. Claire's artwork hangs on walls I painted. Murphy's toys are scattered across floors I refinished. The deck I built hosts dinners with friends and quiet mornings with coffee. This is the life I rebuilt from the wreckage of my marriage, constructed with intention and sustained by honesty. Rachel is out there somewhere, living her own life, carrying her own version of events. I hope she's found peace, though I don't spend much time thinking about it. My concern is with the life in front of me, the one I'm building day by day with someone who values truth as much as I do. The divorce taught me that endings can be gifts, that sometimes the best thing that happens to you is the thing that felt like the worst at the time. Walking out of that courtroom 2 years ago, I'd felt exhausted and uncertain. Now I feel strong and clear, rooted in a life that reflects who I actually am rather than who someone else needed me to be. That's worth more than any settlement or vindication. That's freedom. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.